Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer, and if you're watching us on YouTube, you know you can always check us out wherever fine podcasts are purveyed. If you're listening to us on one of those fine podcast platforms and you want to see what me or my guests look like, mostly my guests because nobody wants to see what I look like, check us out on YouTube. Please leave a review. Give us some star ratings. Let your friends know, let your family members know, and all that jazz that you're liking the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. Joining me today is Tim Stewart. He has spent over 30 years in the legislative and regulatory environment in Washington, D.C., specializing in natural resources and energy issues. He currently serves as the president of the U.S. Oil and Gas Association. USOGA is the oldest trade association representing the oil and gas producers. It was formed in 1917 to support the Great War effort, the war to end all wars. It is comprised of both public and private companies as well, and is affiliated with several state-based oil and gas trade associations. Since 2004, Tim has established 3 different government relations and consulting firms. In 2004, he established the American Capital Group, a full-service government relations firm. In 2009, he helped found Energy North America, an energy consulting firm. And in 2011, he reunited with his former employer, Senator Robert F. Bennett, to establish the Bennett Consulting Group. In these roles, he works with over 50 clients from across the nation and the political and policy spectrum, including energy, transportation, municipalities, Fortune 500 companies, and small businesses. He was the legislative director and chief of staff for the House Committee on Natural Resources, where he managed a staff of 50 professionals and worked closely with the 50 members of the committee. Prior to his time spent working in the House, he served as a top aide to Senator Robert Bennett for 7 years. Senator Bennett was a senior member of the Senate leadership and a policy leader in finance, energy, and the natural resources arena. Tim and his wife, Marcia, currently live in Logan, Utah with their 5 children. He commutes each week to D.C. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Political Science from Utah State University because he is not very good at math. I was told there would be no math. That's why I got involved in media and the regulatory world. He maintains his rural roots by puttering around the family farm and cattle ranch with his brothers in Idaho. Tim, so glad you could join us today.
That is an exhaustive bio. I probably should have trimmed that down significantly.
I did trim it a little bit, but it's one of those things. I can get macabre with you, Tim. When they would read those kinds of bios on the Gilbert Gottfried podcast, Gilbert Gottfried would always end with, found dead alone in his apartment.
Exactly.
Because they do tend to read that way. Of course, you can do that with the puttering around the ranch. Well, I want to get to that later on in the show.
Things make you realize that you used to be somebody once a long time ago, and now you're just a mere shadow of yourself that you are right now. So thanks.
I am reminded of that on a near constant basis. When I talk to people, it's funny. I have a conversation with a colleague, and I mention somebody who goes, "I don't know who that person is. That person isn't anybody if I don't know who he is." And I'm like, no. You're no longer somebody. They're the people who are the somebodies in this world today. So, Tim, we are having a major national discussion about oil and gas policy in the United States. President Biden famously promised to end drilling. We're going to end drilling. We're going to stop drilling. No more drilling. And we're going to get into him delivering on that promise. But let's start off with talking about the state of the oil and gas industry today. And that approach, I mean, is he delivering on that promise? They're saying that they're not delivering on that. It's very confusing, Tim, because they say, sorry, go ahead.
I say, I'm out here in Denver right now, actually coming to you from a hotel room. I'm at actually a conference with the oil and gas producers who are primarily on the western states and on the federal lands. The topics this morning are: what do we do? How do we maintain what we need to be doing with the regulatory and the political environment that we're in? I'll be honest with you, Andrew. It's the most difficult political and regulatory environment for the oil and gas industry I've been in my entire career, my 30 years of doing this. So I don't think for the last 2 years we've experienced anything like this, and nor do I hope we ever do it again.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at this, and I had a conversation with somebody this morning talking about CAFE standards and the electric vehicle mandate. And the really hard-nosed doubling down that the administration is taking on this, again, setting aside, the realities of what it would mean to get us to 60% vehicles sold in America being electric by 2030, 2032. I would say even 2040, 2050. But they are doubling down. They do not want oil to be a part of the picture. But they seem to forget, this is where I want to go here, Tim. It's not just gasoline or diesel fuel or oil or natural gas, that's powering our cars, our trucks, in certain instances, our electric generation. But oil is used for other things. And those other things are not going to go away. I mean, I'm thinking about industrial lubricants. I'm thinking about plastic. Is the left not, I'm sorry, maybe I shouldn't say left, but are the opponents to this, are the folks pushing this, are they being willfully ignorant, or do they just not care?
It's both. It really is both. Yeah. The fact of the matter is, Andrew, fossil fuels in particular is in every aspect of our life. We're basically an $8 trillion global market. If you were to compare oil and gas to, say, minerals and critical the metals market, if we could come in at, say, 2.1 trillion, the top 10 metals markets is just under $1 trillion. So we're twice the size of everything else that makes up every aspect of our life. Global oil demand in particular, that is going to grow. It's growing from 110 million barrels today. The projections are between 120 and 160 million barrels now between now and 2050, which is when we're theoretically supposed to be to net zero. It's not going away. Yeah. The problem is you've got transportation on one side, and I think everybody focuses on transportation. Oh, we're going to be driving EVs. It's going to be wonderful. There's 6,000 consumer products that use petrochemicals as a base ingredient, and that's not going to go away because we don't have a substitute for that. That's everything from toothbrushes to batteries and ibuprofen and everything else. That's what they're not addressing, and that's what they're being dishonest with about, I think.
Well, and there's another part to this, which is, and I want you to talk about this, because, we have these consumer products. They're not going to go away. Let's assume for a moment that we're still drilling for these things at lower levels, and we move to EVs. And stick with me for a second, Tim.
Okay.
When you break down a molecule, let's not say a molecule, let's say a barrel of oil, and you break it down to, use certain components for this and certain components for that, you're left with byproducts, right? When you refine gasoline, or when you refine oil into gasoline, there are byproducts of methane and other anes that come out of there. What we should as a society, we find ways to capture those byproducts and use them. That's how you eliminate pollution, is by finding ways to use the waste. But essentially what they're saying is, we're going to go and we're going to drill and we're going to have all these other things, but then we're going to have these other components that we're not going to use anymore. Like, we're not going to, what do we do with the other, what are they saying? Or again, are they just not addressing that question?
They're just not addressing that question, and all of this is really based on electrification. Again, sort of the public narrative, and you see it in the media, particularly because it's the oversimplification, is that all of our climate issues are going to go away if we just completely electrify everything. If we electrify vehicles, if we electrify our gas, get rid of our gas stoves and just put electric appliances in, that everything will be fine and climate will be saved. The reality is, though, is that the growth in electrical generation that is needed to get from here to there, they cannot meet those standards with just basically wind and solar. The growth in natural gas, for example, for electricity generation is projected to grow at least or remain constant all the way through 2050. So even if we can get rid of all the gas stoves, but the fact of the matter is if you want to charge your car, if you want to power that new stove that you have, you're probably going to be using natural gas to do that. We're still 60 to 65% of any electricity generated anywhere in the United States at any given time. It doesn't matter if it's California, New York, or the other virtue signaling states. At any particular given time, 60 to 65% of that electricity being generated is coming from fossil fuels, primarily natural gas. And you can't take that away and replace it overnight, let alone the consumer products you're talking about, the other things that you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's a situation. You were a Hill staffer, a Natural Resources Committee, working for Senator Bennett for many, many years. You've seen these debates happen up on Capitol Hill. And one of the things, not that I need you to make a political statement about nuclear power, but for me, one of the litmus tests always is, if you're really serious about about climate issues and you want to get rid of gas or petrochemical, or fossil fuel electricity generation, then you have to be looking at nuclear. Am I wrong there that that's sort of what distinguishes it between a political and a scientific argument?
No, you're exactly right. Look, there needs to be some sort of baseload power generated that is reliable, that you can turn on and off immediately, have it be there. Obviously, nuclear is certainly that best option, and from the oil and gas industry, we strongly support the nuclear industry because they've been beat up just like we have. They've been demonized just like we have. Interesting. You mentioned policy and policy statement. I think it's really important to realize that the oil and gas industry is not a partisan industry, frankly.
Right.
We're partisan in the fact that if you support us, I don't care if you're a Democrat or Republican or what state you're from, if you support us, we love you and we support you. If you fight us, we have to fight you back. It doesn't matter if you're Republican or Democrat. The sad thing that I witnessed over 30 years, and you've probably seen this too, is over the last 30 years, energy, and particularly oil and gas, it has changed from a geographic issue to a politically partisan issue. When you and I first started working on the Hill many years ago and doing all the things that we did, it didn't matter if you were a Republican or Democrat. If you were from Texas or Oklahoma, you supported the oil and gas industry.
Right.
If you're from California and you were a Democrat and you had oil and gas production in that district of yours, you supported that. And what's happened is the climate narrative, the climate politics, and the climate dogma has driven such a wedge that we have Democrats who have strong production in their industry or in their districts, and they are very reticent to support the industry. It's a sad thing that we've gone from basically a geopolitical support base to a partisan policies support base, and I wish we could break through that. That's why we support the Democratic Oil and Gas Caucus. We need those votes. We need those votes.
Oh, absolutely. And they seem to be the only ones on their side who seem to be understanding the realities of the situation. As my father is fond of saying, I used to say the most well-intentioned policies eventually bump up against very real realities. And my father, who is an environmental scientist, occupational safety and health scientist, he said, Andrew, you're making it too complicated. He said, there are many roads to utopia. All, however, must traverse the surface of the earth. And he's absolutely right. And you have to sort of recognize these things. Let me ask you this, because one of the problems that we have, right, we have a problem of, in the United States, California driving a lot of policy that sort of forces industries elsewhere to adopt it, or the federal government to adopt what they're doing. That's bad. The other side of this are international organizations, which have U.S. citizens have no oversight over. They have no ability to influence policy. We've seen this in the environmental arena and the occupational safety and health arena, where we are adopting I don't remember what the word is, but we are adopting sort of by recognition these international standards of things. What happens when the UN, we re-entered the Paris Accords, the UN starts dictating policy to the U.S., the World Economic Forum? What happens when these unelected organizations start dictating policy that we then adopt by inference? I believe is the word I'm looking for.
Yeah, and then I guess the question is you look at Germany, and I think our response is don't be like Germany right now. Andrew, the whole issue is kind of based around this net zero concept.
Yep.
We have to, by 2050, get to what's called net zero, which is net zero carbon emissions. And that sounds great because it's a long ways away theoretically. When they first started talking about this 10 years ago, it was, we can do this, we can do this. But then we start looking into what that actually is required, okay? And so net zero is everything carbon produced, and that's road vehicles, that's flying, that's shipping, that's materials and production, that's construction, that's every aspect of our life has to assume this net zero concept. And for this roadmap that your father's talking about, traversing the earth, let me give folks some ideas as to what this actually means to get to net zero by 2050, absolute zero. Let's look at flying, for example. Okay, this is my weekly commute to Washington, D.C., and this is based on what the Europeans are saying, and they're translating to the U.S. primarily through the big states, the blue states, California and New York. Okay, let's look at flying. What they have said in particular is that by 2049, and this is a direct quote, all remaining airports close, and by 2050, when you get to absolute zero, there is no flying, period. There's no air traffic.
Right.
Electric planes may fly with synthetic fuel once they have reached their non-emitting electricity supplies, but we have to develop electric airplanes. And so they actually openly admit that 2050, two important things: there'll be no flying and there'll be no global shipping. With no flying and global shipping, we're going to party like it's 1699, to be honest.
This is exactly what I was thinking, right? I remember a world in which we had, nobody flying, shipping being powered by the wind, and it was the great age of sail. I mean, it was, it was taking a week to get between DC and New York, if there was a DC, or Richmond and New York, or New York and Boston, or Boston and Philadelphia. Right. I lived through this, but.
And this is right there in their documents. They say with the complete phase out of fossil fuels by 2050, this is what will happen. We literally go back to 1699, and they're perfectly fine with that. And so my question is, don't be like Germany. Don't be like California. We can't afford to do this.
And the reality is, right, and first of all, let me ask you, so the net zero policy comes from where? Who determined the net zero policy?
Well, it's been evolving over time. I mean, obviously, the NGOs have been pushing the IPC, the International Protocol of Climate Change, all the UN groups. But honestly, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but the World Economic Forum has been largely the one who has been driving this. And
because we know that in the end, it's the wealthiest around the world who would be immune from this, because they'll be able to afford to pay whatever fines they want to do to fly and go in experimental electric vehicles and what have you. They can live these. I'm sorry, go ahead, Tim.
But you're exactly right. And it sort of pushes us back into a caste system. It's the haves and the have-nots. It's the beautiful people and the non-beautiful people, so to speak. And again, I'm not a tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist. At least I didn't used to be. But what I've learned, honestly, we're working with this administration on gas stoves and everything else. There's the capture rate between me having a tinfoil hat conspiracy theory and the reality actually coming through is about 90 days, unfortunately. So you see that on climate emergency.
Remember what Woody Allen said: just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not after you.
Exactly. And
I think it's, sorry, go ahead.
Gas stoves, climate emergency, all that stuff. They're there.
Well, I mean, and that's just it, right? I mean, there's a certain degree of gas lighting that's involved here, because we were told that, folks started to talk about a gas stove ban. We were told there was no gas stove ban. Yet here we are with the EPA putting standards that are effectively going to ban gas stoves. New York talking about getting rid of gas stoves in new construction. Montgomery County, Maryland talking about getting rid of gas stoves in new construction. That's what they want to do. But, and that's, I mean, we can make jokes about returning essentially to the pre-industrial, and that's what it is. It's returning to the pre-industrial age.
Absolutely.
Sorry, go ahead.
It's actually called it's the deindustrialization is what they refer to. The decarbonization requires deindustrialization. And, when you look at Montgomery County, for example, and it's saying, well, we're going to restrict natural gas hookups for new construction so we can meet our net zero goals by 2050. It's ridiculous that a local municipality thinks that by putting a ban on new gas stations or putting a ban on new natural gas hookups, they're going to have any significant impact on net zero goals. Is just crazy, but that's what they've embraced.
Here's a weird thing, and again, it's going to sound like a conspiracy theory, and it's something you and I haven't talked about in the past, Tim. One of my great concerns over the years is international standard-setting organizations create these codes, like municipal codes, that municipalities or counties or whatever buy wholesale, like international fire standards codes or zoning codes, et cetera. I got hip to this by a reporter for the Wall Street Journal when I was lobbying for the National Federation of Independent Business. There was a thrift store, and let's say a residence challenged person came into the thrift store. They didn't have a public restroom. The residence challenged person urinated on the floor, and instead of the person being arrested, the store got fined because there was a municipal plumbing code that said every business had to have a public restroom made available. And nobody knew about it because the municipality had bought this code wholesale off of a shelf, paid money for it, and then adopted it without really going through it. Maybe you haven't thought about this, but this is a problem, right? These international standard-setting organizations can be influenced by these policies like net zero. And so all of a sudden, even without Congress saying anything or the EPA promulgating regulations, all of a sudden a county has no no natural gas hookups in construction because some code setting organization has put it in there. Are you tracking any of this, or have I just completely come out of left field at you?
No, you're exactly right. I mean, and this is what my industry has to deal with on a daily basis, whether or not you produce on federal lands. Let me take it up 4 levels of like on international sort of standard and standard creating. We are waiting for this dam to break on all of these regulatory actions the administration has alluded to, or theoretically the rulemaking which is underway, but they've either slow walked. We're waiting for that to happen. It'll likely happen during the next COP28 conference that's coming up here, because they want to be me too, look what we're doing. And so I imagine that things have been very quiet, but also the U.S. will announce a number of significant regulatory initiatives so they can show how much they're doing with the rest of the international community who's adopted these standards of net zero practices. That's that, and that has, that has impacts of trillions and trillions of dollars into our economies, what they're trying to do here. And so I have, my oil and gas companies are downstairs who are talking about what it's like to have to deal on federal lands and make sure that the archaeologist will record the temperature on the day they're conducting the archaeological survey on the potential federal lease. Because if you don't have that temperature recorded, then it is taken out. You have to start your permit process all over again. And so you have small things, a little death of 1,000 paper cuts. At the same time, your administration is announcing massive new regulations that are coming down on top of that.
I will say an early college girlfriend of mine was a senior archaeologist at the Department of the Interior and resigned from the Department of the Interior under Donald Trump's tenure because they were trying, how dare they try to remove these rules about taking temperatures at these sites, to make it easier for people to go down this road. Let me ask you this, because we're really talking about, when we talk about these international standard setting organizations or Davos, the World Economic Forum, the UN, we're really talking about the industrialized world. So we're talking about the United States and Canada. We're talking about Western Europe for the most part, but we're not talking about China. We're not talking about India. We're not talking about nations in Africa that are developing, nor should we. I mean, it's their right. If they want to develop their economies using reliable, inexpensive carbon-based fuels, they should do that. But my point is, it's not as though the entire world is going down this road. It is countries that are willing to sacrifice their economies and go back to 1699, and let these other countries go into the 22nd century down the road.
For whatever reason, it's this unilateral disarmament that's being led by the Europeans.
Yes.
This sort of happens. I'm going to wax philosophical here for a second.
Please.
But this sort of the climate is now largely it's sort of a religious approach. It is the I will have salvation if I make these sacrifices.
Right.
And we all need to do this. It's this mass conversion of our entire country, our entire economy. And if we don't do that, then we're bad people. And it's this unilateral disarmament. Frankly, China, India, the others emerging countries, Brazil, are saying, by all means, please go ahead and do that. It's fascinating, though, Andrew. If you think about the costs and the impacts of deindustrialization, the way that differentiates us from a first world to a third world country is we have reliable energy. That's right. What makes a first world country is energy powers everything else we do, whether it be being virtuous or being industrious. But energy powers that, right? And if you intentionally break up and your ability to generate energy in a reliable and consistent way, if you're relying strictly on the sun or wind or biofuels or some other thing, and not providing that consistency, you really do become a third world country despite your best intentions. And this is, philosophically, it's a dangerous route for us to go down because we're making value judgments that we are virtuous, but we're also stupid. It's crazy to be going down this route.
Well, it goes down this road, and I think that our side has done, well, and you and I have talked about quite a bit about this, is the issue of engagement and getting average, everyday American people involved in these things, but also telling the story, and this is where our friends at the Competitive Enterprise Institute have been particularly good over the years, right, about telling the stories about how this impacts working families. I used to say when I was with NFIB, it was small businesses and the working families that depend on them. They go hand in hand. and we're doing a better job, but I think we still need to do an even better job at sort of explaining how this impacts the poorest of Americans, drives up their prices. Right? We know we can talk about the science fiction view of the world, like, and I don't think this is fiction in that it's not going to happen, or the dystopian view of the world, where everybody lives in cities, everybody is on government-run mass transit that works some of the time or doesn't work some of the time, in apartments that are powered by electricity that doesn't work all of the time, but is really expensive. But we do a really, I think, a bad job at sort of putting it in the way that motivates people to go out and vote, whether it's Democratic voters in urban centers who don't understand why their rents are going up or why their utility rates are going up or fluctuate, or why we can no longer buy an inexpensive car. Actually, I want to digress for a second there, Tim, because I've been talking to folks, with this new electric vehicle mandate, the administration is so wedded to this that they will not include gas electric hybrids in their mandate. It has to be all electric or nothing, which is insane. And again, it's one of these things where the cost can come down because we understand it better over time, but they don't care, and yet they're the party of the working poor. Talk about that.
So they're two. So first of all, and I have an EV. We'll jump into that in a minute here. But Andrew, what you're really talking about is the impacts on families. You're talking about energy poverty, and energy poverty is real. It didn't used to be, but it has somehow emerged in the last 3 years that people have to make choices as to how to spend their limited funds. And when you look at inflation numbers, for example, what they don't care about the cost of new appliances. What they care about is what they have to buy every week, which is food, and energy. Okay. And the administration and these 150 plus executive actions they've taken since January 2021 have actually created a situation where there are millions of people in America who are facing, if they're not already in there, energy poverty. And it is a sad thing because we are the world's energy superpower. We're the number one producer in oil and natural gas, number two producer in coal, number two in wind and solar, everything else. We have more energy than the rest of the world has. And we really are the envy of the world because we can be completely self-sustaining if we want to be. Now, having said that, we've got these millions of people facing energy poverty, and yet their elected officials, their government is pushing them further and further down the road on very, very unrealistic mandates. I have an electric vehicle. I bought it primarily as the president of the U.S. Oil and Gas Association so I could bitch about it, how bad it was. And frankly, it's provided incredible fodder for me as to how practically unrealistic it is to live in Logan, Utah, which is a municipal, 100,000 person municipal area, right? So it's not like I'm living out in the country. But the closest level 2 charger for me and my trip to Salt Lake back and forth from the airport is 42 miles away at a supercharger in a Walmart supercenter in Brigham City. The infrastructure just isn't there. We have 286 million vehicles in the United States right now. We have 2 million electric vehicles. We do not, nor will we have the infrastructure to support those current 2 million vehicles, let alone a unrealistic 50% of all vehicles must be electric by 2030. It's just not there. And we have to be completely realistic, let alone the 4 million semi-trucks that are on the road that are moving food and clothing and other goods and services around that are not even close to being electrified. Again, the media puts out, frankly, a false and a clearly unrealistic narrative being driven by the administration and the other policymakers that this is going to be happening and we're all going to be fat and happy. And the reality is it is going to be a long, long, long transition for us to get there.
And one of the things I like to talk about are the trade-offs that are involved. I mean, which again is something that the administration doesn't seem to understand. There is a finite amount. You and I could spend hours talking about oil as a fossil fuel or the abiotic origins of oil. Right. I'm a big fan of what Thomas Gold had to say. My dad has a degree in mineralogy, and I spent a lot of time talking about this concept but the reality is we do know that there is a limited amount, there is a finite amount of cobalt and lithium and other of the, again, just look at the periodic table, the way the periodic table goes. That, it's listed in order of abundance, essentially.
Yeah.
And yet the environmental impact is huge when we talk about these things. Let's not talk about this quite yet. I made that point. What I want to talk about, though, is the relationship between the federal government and your industry when it comes to the public lands. So I spent a lot of time working on public lands issues. And as I said at the thesis at the start of this, President Biden said, no more drilling. And he meant it. And we've seen it. We've seen proposals that'll reduce drilling in the Gulf of Mexico by 35%. We just had oil and gas leases on the public lands up in Alaska canceled. And yet the administration is saying, no, we're not ending drilling on public lands. We have issued more leases for lands available than ever, and folks are not taking it. Talk about the disconnect with this.
Yeah, and so for the folks listening, let me give you just kind of what it's like to do business on federal lands, kind of a 101, if that's all right. The federal lands actually they hold about 25% of our total oil and gas resources, which is great. It amounts for about 10% of the U.S. production, 8 to 10% depending on the year, and depending on how offshore is going. But that's that 8 to 10% of our overall U.S. production. We produce 12 million barrels a day. And if we were to actually take President Biden at face value when he says we're going to take federal production to zero, that creates a market gap of almost 1 million barrels a day in the United States. And that million barrel a day gap was what we saw in July of last year, in July of 2022, and oil was $130 a barrel, and we were all paying $5 plus. That's because we had 1 million barrel gap between producers and what the refiners were able to push out. So the asset is there. The prediction that we're going to make it go away is completely unrealistic. And you want to talk about energy poverty, that's a good way to push people into energy poverty. My oil and gas producers on the federal lands, the permitting process is very, very complex. It's a multi-stage process. You have to go through and you have to nominate a parcel. And you do that on a hunch and a prayer. That's why they're called wildcatters. They really are sort of making an educated guess. Those individual parcels go through a very intensive review process before they're even suggested to be nominated for leases. They go through environmental review, they go through public input. And theoretically, that vetting process is supposed to be over when the parcels are nominated and put up for a public bid because they've gone through that analysis at the BLM level, at the federal level. What happens, though, is that's where the real process begins. And if the administration is leasing, those leases are most usually protested by environmental groups. Let me give you some statistics real quick.
Of course.
1998, Clinton administration sold 7,200. It had 7,200 individual lease parcels that were sold. That's a lot. 1% of those were protested. You fast forward 20 plus years, and the Trump administration could only get 1,420 leases out in 2020 because of the environmental litigation process and the constraints. So we're down to 1,400 federal leases, and 72% of those were then protested.
Wow.
I imagine that this administration, which has yet to be able to get even 100 lease sales put up for sale, 99.9% of those are going to be protested. So all intents and purposes, they have stopped the federal leasing process. Theoretically, it's going, but it's not actually happening.
Let's be really clear here. All federal lands are not alike. I'm going to give you all a quick lesson here, Tim. You can go back to your conference now because I'm only joking. So you look west of the Rocky Mountains and west. The vast majority of the land is publicly owned for a whole host of reasons that we don't need to get into, having to do with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and these state enabling acts, where the federal government had this duty to dispose of these lands. But the federal government wound up retaining them because nobody wanted to buy them, because nobody knew about the mineral output or the oil output. So they held on to them. And then in the late 1970s, the Congress passed the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, where this duty to dispose became a duty to retain. And they retained all these lands. But the reality is you have lands that are managed by the Bureau of Land Management, which is a resource management agency. It's not supposed to be a recreation agency. The National Forest Service is a resource management agency. These are trees that are supposed to be grown to be cut down. It's not a recreation agency. Yet people, and I will say this, in the coastal states, the coastal elites, this is where I want you to come in, Tim, they treat all of these lands as though they are supposed to be locked up as permanent wilderness, and that's not what's supposed to happen, is it?
No, and that's because the opportunity cost for me being a member of Congress from Northern Virginia or Connecticut, I have no opportunity costs on my constituent levels to be able to make some radical wilderness designations for 12 million acres in Utah. It's an easy thing.
Sure.
And I grew up in a public land state. Utah, I think, is at 65% owned by the federal government, if not higher. Nevada's like 87%. So all those states
Yes.
Essentially the federal government is their landlord.
I'm going to interrupt you. So my first experience on this, I think I said this to you a while back. I worked for a blind environmental lawyer, and we were representing the county of Nye County, Nevada. Nye County is the size of Vermont and New Hampshire combined, and it is 93% owned by the federal government. And the Forest Service shut down a road between two of the major cities. So, if you have City A and City B and City C, they closed the road between these two. So you had to go all the way over here and all the way over here in order to get to get between these two cities, go like 100 miles out of your way. You had to deal with the federal government, and they were refusing. So at one point, a county commissioner got very frustrated and bulldozed open the road, and the county got sued as a whole big thing. But you have this situation where folks back east don't understand the vast swatches of geography and the impact of federal land ownership. I'm sorry, Tim, go ahead.
For the oil and gas industry, the easy line that the environmentalists feed out, and then frankly their sycophants in Congress will repeat back is, well, you can't have oil and gas drilling everywhere. And we say you're exactly right. You have to have it where the oil and gas is. That's where you have to have it. And using Utah, my home state, for example, if I was an oil and gas producer in Utah and I wanted to go develop a federal and a state lease, I would have to comply with 127 different federal and state laws to be able to develop that lease. The irony is that my leasehold position can be separated by a fence line and have the federal asset over here and the state asset here. And the permit process and the time that I can develop my state parcel is somewhere between 10 and 21 days. And on the federal leases, it's somewhere between 180 days and never. Literally, the only difference is a fence line on those two parcels. And that's exactly how these producers actually have to deal with. Frankly, Andrew, doing business on the federal lands is so fraught with peril. It's so risky now. It is easier, frankly, to do work on tribal lands than it is to do on federal lands. And so oil and gas producers, when they have to assemble a large leasehold position in Colorado or Wyoming, they first look to where can we secure private lands, where can we secure state lands and coddle together tribal lands. And if we have to take a federal leasehold position, we will do it. But the reality is we can't afford to have our leases held up for days and in perpetuity from the federal level when it costs us $60,000 a day to site a rig. That goes to this permit process real quick. That's why we always get the crap kicked out of us for sitting on permits. Well, the fact is we actually have to we have to bank permits, because it is such risk with the administration. We cannot let our rigs get ahead of our permits and our applications to be permitted. So.
And let me ask you this. The other side of this is securing financing for these wildcatters, the independent oil producers. So there's the regulatory issues, there's the risk inherent in dealing with the federal government, but then there are all of these new banking and investment regulations that are pushing this ESG, the environmental and social governance agenda, which makes it harder for them to secure financing. Or am I wrong here? I think I understand this. Yeah.
Yeah, you're 100% right. And actually, that was the topic of the conversation this morning, right before I came to talk with you. The salad days of the 2015, 2016, 2017 days are over when there was a lot of private equity flowing into the oil and gas industry.
Right.
When institutional investors being driven by shareholder and stakeholder activists, the BlackRocks of the world began to push back, we saw that capital start to dry up. The Biden administration has been very, very good at creating uncertainty for the capital markets. But what we've found has been really interesting. I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine set the world alight with regards to the fact that this we're doing away with fossil fuels by 2050 is going to be. They've come to the conclusion maybe that's not a good idea. And the smart money, honestly, has started to go around the BlackRocks, go around the administration, and it's starting to find its way back into some good oil and gas projects.
Listen, can we talk about this? Because you bring up Russia and Ukraine, and I know we hadn't really talking about this, but I want to say this because you were up on the Hill for a long time. And again, dealing with Democrats, and you had pro-oil and gas Democrats. I posed this question. So I went to a very lefty high school in New York. Those high school students come down for one of the big conservative conferences every other year. They come down for it. And I asked them a question. It's a general question that I have. And it's sort of something, it's about trade-offs and compromise. And I said to these young people, I said, okay, how many of you think that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is bad? They all raised their hands. I said, how many of you think that climate change is bad? They all raised their hands. I said, okay, How many of you would be willing? We know that there is a proximate threat here, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We know that the only way Russia funds its war machine is through petrodollars. How many of you would be willing to allow, a major ramping up of U.S. oil and gas production so that we could bottom out the oil and gas markets worldwide, so that the Russians, they could not sell their oil the way that they want to sell their oil right now, because we would be constantly undercutting them? And a handful of kids raised their hand and said, yeah, that would be a good thing. I would be willing to do that. I was dismayed because probably an equal number said, no. Climate change is a bigger threat than Russia, and we need to be cutting oil and gas drilling. Talk about that in terms of the global marketplace and sort of those kinds of trade-offs that we're dealing with.
It's been really interesting to watch the global markets, and exactly why the Saudis cut their production. They announced that production cut 3 months ago, and we're now actually feeling the pinch of it, the bite of it, because they took 1 million barrels a day offline. They did that because we were hovering around the $60, $65 range, based on the fact that Russia was skirting the sanctions and had not met their production quotas. They were actually they're going above their production quotas because they're selling at a 40% discount. Yeah. And so the Saudis are trying to keep the global market stabilized, realizing that the plus in OPEC plus, which is Russia, is not actually sticking to their quotas. And so the Saudis had to do something to prop up the price. It's been really interesting. If you want to talk about where you want to follow the flow of Russian crude, it really is fascinating. You've got Russian crude, which is being sold at a 40% discount. The Indians and the Chinese are buying it up.
Oh, yeah.
The Indians and the Chinese have ramped up their refining capacity significantly. So they're actually offloading offshore, so that they're skirting the sanctions. They're refining it and selling it back to the Europeans at a premium. And so the Europeans are, think, well, these sanctions we're working, but the reality is we're paying much more for natural gas and for petroleum products that are coming from Russia just via China versus via India. It's not accomplishing, and frankly, we're still committing, emissions are still happening because we're still using fossil fuels. It's really a fascinating thing, So
let's note that the Chinese are doing this, and they're running their economy on cheap Russian oil, while at the same time they are trying to corner the market for electric vehicles in Europe, and they have their eyes on the U.S. I mean, it really is a situation where, again, I'm not going to say our heads are in the sand or where our heads might be, but our heads are largely in the sand on this in terms of our policies. So let's talk about this, because we've gotten to Saudis have cut production, by 1 million barrels a day. The rest of the oil market is unstable. We're cutting production and sending signals that we're going to continue to cut production. I have made a bet with a reporter actually, I don't know if he ever accepted, but I tried making a bet with a columnist for the Baltimore Sun over where gas prices were going to be a year from now. I mean, Tim, not that you need to forecast this, but if things continue where they are, where do you see gas prices going? Or is it really a matter of fluctuation overall?
This is where, speaking of being fraught with peril, this is where I try not to make predictions, because sometimes it gets picked up. And I can easily be wrong. I think where we're at right now, so the fact of the matter is that when crude accounts for 57% of all gasoline prices, the price of crude is up, and that's why we're paying more for the pump. I think the big issues are we can actually, and we've proven ourselves as the U.S. positioned itself as a swing producer, we can offset anything that happens with the global markets if we do it right. Where we have found that
if we do it right,
where our inherent weakness actually is in our refining capacity.
Yeah.
We have refineries that were built in the 60s and the 70s and designed to refine that heavy crude coming in from overseas, coming in from Saudi, coming in from Venezuela. When places like the Permian come online and it's that light, sweet crude, our refiners can't refine that, and so we actually have to send it to Mexico to be refined, or elsewhere. And so that's why we have an export market of U.S. crude while we're importing. And the weak link in this whole system is, frankly, there's this refining capacity. And this goes back to this investment issue, Andrew. We will never be able to get down to $1.25 or $1.50 if we don't have the refining capacity, and we will not have the refining capacity because the administration right now is saying it is a fool's errand to bet $2 billion on a refinery upgrade. We haven't built a new refinery in the U.S. since 1976. Right. And that's still, it doesn't matter what happens to the global prices. Honestly, if we can't improve our refining capacity, we're still going to be having serious problems.
It's like everything else. It's like we don't sort of understand that there are many links in this chain that we need to deal with. My wife and I talk about the cost of medical care and how we need to produce more doctors. And then my wife says, well, we could produce more doctors in medical schools, but we don't have enough residency programs to train them. It's the same thing. We could produce more oil, and we should, and that'll have some impact. But if we're not refining that oil here at home, we're not building new refineries. We can't go. Tim Stewart, let me ask you this before I let you go. You live in Utah. It's got to be a commute, a heck of a commute back and forth to D.C. once a week. But you're also spending time up in Idaho at the ranch. Talk about the ranch a little bit. Talk about your free time.
Well, we should call it a ranch. It's actually, the name of the ranch is called Disappointment Acres. It's actually the old dairy farm that my dad raised his 10 kids on. I'm the youngest of 10 kids. My brother, who has been a saint, has been running the farm for the last 40 years.
Wow.
It's good people out there. We left, actually, so I grew up in Utah, came to Washington, D.C. to work for Bob Bennett when he was first elected way back in 1993. And that's where I cut my teeth on energy policy and things like that. We raised our family there. We live in Northern Virginia, but during COVID, when the sort of people lost their minds in that Washington, D.C. area, you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Sure.
And that spilled over to the schools, frankly. We looked at what was happening to our kids in the schools, and we thought, we can't do this. We actually we have the house that I grew up in out there in Utah. We'd owned it for years. Nice. Never lived in it. We said it's time to go. So it was a small sacrifice. It was one of those things where little divine inspiration said, you probably should do this. It's better for a family. My kids have thrived in Utah, and it's a thing for us.
I got a weird question because, it always struck me the times that I would go home to New York. Now, my parents are living where I live in Virginia, which is also strange, being 10 minutes from my parents for the first time in, 30 years. But is it weird living in the house that you grew up in? I mean, what's that like? Or is it just not even noticeable?
No, it's awesome. The neighbor, my next door neighbor who didn't like me when I was 8 years old, still doesn't particularly like me.
Oh, that's so funny.
Yeah, she's always views me as that obnoxious little boy. So,
it's real quick. It's funny because my wife's cousin randomly bought the house that his parents owned before he was born, the house that they were married in. And again, it was the same weird dynamic with the same neighbor, 40 plus years later. It's very weird how those things happen. Anyway, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Tim.
They're great folks, though. And frankly, where I grew up, we were out in the middle of nowhere, and now we're surrounded by houses, and it's been all built up.
Wow.
But it is a beautiful place. And there are times when I really do think I am not deserving of the blessings that I've been given. And frankly, to this point of the community, Andrew, it is a small sacrifice to have to make to be able to watch your kids thrive in a school system that teaches the real things. So
I'm going to get a little choked up here, Tim, but I would give anything to be able to spend another night in the house where I grew up in. We've met the new owners of the house. I was up there a year ago. I would give anything just to sort of wake up and to be able to go out, some summer morning and smell the smells that I can still smell in my mind. Anyway, Tim, listen, I wish you the best of luck. I'm sorry, do you have anything else? Go ahead.
I grew up on my parents' lot was 3 acres, and the giant elm tree that's there that my childhood dog is buried under. I'm still there.
Oh.
It's a great place. I'll send you pictures. It's been great spending time with you, Andrew. Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you.
Tim Stewart, president of the U.S. Oil and Gas Association. Thank you. Thank you so very much. This has been yet another episode of the Lunch Hour with the Federal Newswire. As I said, if you're watching us on YouTube, check us out wherever fine podcasts are purveyed. If you're listening to us on one of those platforms, please go and check us out on YouTube. Leave us a review, leave us a rating, let your friends and family members know. I'm Andrew Langer, your host. See you all next week. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.